Let me pick up the political-economic thread from where I left off. When I talk about the transportation revolution, I speak about it in terms of technological change, but also the role of policy and the growth of national markets. Financing the transportation improvements is also part of the story, in which public investment in roads and canals inspired private investors to follow in once the idea is proven to work. But this brings up the role of government in the economy, which means, of course, we're talking about politics. Let me pick up the political thread at the Missouri Compromise, which saved the Union but highlighted its fragility. It showed how economic differences between the sections, slaves and plantations in the South versus the industrializing Northeast, were emerging. This partisanship showed in the way the Compromise of 1820 kept the balance in the Senate between slave states and free states, because each state sends 2 representatives. As the nation expanded into the West, with different economic structures in the North and South, expansion meant that each new free state threatened the power of slave owners in the national government. So expansion into the West and the formation of new states meant conflict between slave states and free states, conflict over the control of government through the Senate. I last spoke about party politics in the first party system, when Thomas Jefferson's presidential nomination came from the Democrat-Republicans, in opposition to the Federalists, who had written the Constitution and represented the big government, big business side of political life. Now, we turn to the second party system, whose most obvious representative is Andrew Jackson, elected President of the U.S. in 1828 and re-elected in 1832. He was a character. He inherited Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party, but called it the Democratic Party. He cast himself as a man of the people. Although he was a rich man and a slave owner with a large plantation, he had a style the American people enjoyed. He was born in South Carolina in 1767. He fought in the Revolution and was America's last president to have fought in that great founding moment. He was even a prisoner of war for a time. He had moved west with the nation, settling in Tennessee by 1787, where he worked as a lawyer and became Tennessee's first congressman when it became a state, then briefly U.S. Senator. He then distinguished himself as an Indian fighter in the Creek War, which was part of the War of 1812 when the British tried to regain the United States as a colony. The Creek War involved factions among different bands of the Creek tribe of Native Americans, and he sided with one side of the tribe and helped defeat the other, the Red Stick Creeks, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Then he was responsible for defeating the British at the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815. The War of 1812 marked the United States and its independence as a reality, and his role in the decisive battle made his reputation national. Frontierman, Indian fighter, Revolutionary War veteran, lawyer, senator, he's an ideal candidate for president. But he's also a contradictory character, and this is a tricky period of American history. It doesn't entirely make sense to me, Jacksonian America and the second party system. My argument in today's lecture is about economic growth, partly brought about by transportation revolution, partly by simple expansion, new lands, new population, and the seemingly boundless opportunity of the new nation and its manifest destiny. And I think it's true that this market revolution, as it's sometimes called, brought out the tensions and conflicts in the nation, leading to civil war. But it's a contradictory period with lots of forward and back in its impulses, so I'm going to tell you some of that, and also express my confusion about it, as well as my thoughts about how this period fits into the bigger picture. He was a Southern planter with a common touch. He owned the Hermitage Plantation and 150 enslaved people. He ran for the presidency in 1824 and was the first American president to actually campaign for the position. In the first party system, men like Jefferson had been put forward by their friends but did not act on their own behalf. Jackson was different. He actively campaigned for the presidency and wrote a campaign biography. He was the first presidential candidate to do so, and it has become standard practice ever since. In his biography, he claimed that he had been born in a log cabin, and this would serve other presidential candidates as a marker of American authenticity, up to Abraham Lincoln at the end of our story. So Andrew Jackson was running for president among the Democrat Republicans in 1824. He ran against John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who had been the Federalist second president of the United States, the favorite in New England, against William Harris Crawford of Georgia, then Secretary of the Treasury, and also against Henry Clay, the senator from Kentucky, who had brokered the Missouri Compromise of 1820. I'm going to be using this kind of map right through the end of the semester, so get used to reading it. These are maps of presidential elections, and this one starts off our analysis of the second party system. You see the candidates in the bottom left. In the key to the map, each state was won by a particular candidate. And each state also has the number of electors in the Electoral College. Here you see ME for Maine has 9, New Hampshire has 8, and Vermont 7, and so on, all pink, all won by John Quincy Adams, along with the rest of New England. Get down to the mid-Atlantic, though, and you can see that Andrew Jackson, in green, won Pennsylvania's 28 electoral votes, 99 altogether. And when you look at these pie charts, it's obvious that Jackson won the election. He had a plurality, the most votes, though not a majority since there were so many candidates. He won 43% of the popular vote and 38% of the Electoral College. John Adams was behind him in both. But Henry Clay gave his 37 electoral votes to John Quincy Adams and thereby handed him the presidency. In turn, Adams made Henry Clay his Secretary of State. So, the election of 1824 handed the presidency to John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, though he had come in second. Andrew Jackson called this a corrupt bargain and riled up the people to his side. He ran against President Adams and defeated him handily in 1828. You see that Adams took nothing but New England, and Jackson ran away with both the popular vote and the Electoral College. He would be re-elected in 1832, and this period of American history bears his name, Jacksonian America. The old Democrat-Republican Party was dead, and Jackson headed a party called the Democrats, which still exists today. It was a period of massive political involvement. The Democratic Party expanded the franchise, meaning it gave the vote to more people, counting as legal persons with rights to vote almost all the white male adults, not just those who owned property. Voter turnout was high. Something like 80% of the eligible population voted. Remember, that's adult white males, but still, it's impressive. Today, usually 48% of the voting population at the most actually bothers to do it. The Democrats and their opponents campaigned to get votes and traded votes for spoils, like jobs and stuff, and this is the start of the modern political party in America. Who were the opponents of this populist uprising? From the ashes of the old Federalists came a new party, constituted under Henry Clay, the senator from Kentucky, responsible for the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Clay transformed the Federalists into a new, formal political party he named the Whig Party, after the British political party and group of commentators and journalists who had supported the American Revolution. Here, you can see that the Whigs adopted the Federalist imagery, the American eagle, and like the Federalists, the Whigs represented the big government stream in American political history. The Whigs stood for progress and the importance of the federal government in stimulating economic growth. The party stood for government support for commerce, especially in the form of internal improvements, and, as you can see here, for tariffs, all to aid manufacturers. Whigs stood for economic modernization. factories, canals, railroads, and banks, all supported by the state or even the federal government. The rationale was that government primed the pump for economic growth. You can see from the handbill above that the goal was no annexation, no admission of states without the due process regulated by the Constitution, and no extension of slavery into the West. Whigs were concerned with slavery in terms of its extension into the West, and subsequent power in the federal government in the form of senators from slave states. Along the way, the feeling was gathering that slavery choked off opportunity for non-slave-owning whites. Nonetheless, Whigs had supporters among the planters who wanted government help in the form of roads and transportation improvements to help them settle the West for cotton plantations. The Whigs were the party of expansion, and really a party that represented the West, as Clay was from Kentucky, which at that point represented new settlements after the colonies. In 1832, Clay ran for president, but hadn't yet formed the Whigs. You can see that it was a blowout for Andrew Jackson, the incumbent president and populist Democrat. So, Clay created the Whigs, which ran a bunch of presidential candidates in 1836. Don't worry about this complicated period of American political history. Just recognize that the Whigs had a stronghold in the Midwest, which was to them in the 1830s, the West, with some support in New England and the Mid-Atlantic and Chesapeake. The Democrats had a nationwide following around the charismatic Andrew Jackson, and if the Whigs were a regional party, it was the party of the West. Basically, the political parties had not yet coalesced into a division between North and South. This was the second party system. The leftover Democrats from Jefferson's day, revived by Andrew Jackson's presidency into a nationwide populist party that expanded the electorate and responded to a raucous politics deeply engaged in voters' lives. In response, Henry Clay, one-time Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams, repeating presidential contender, created the Whigs, which rose from the West to aim for settlement, expansion, and growth with the help of the government, tariffs, and internal improvements. Andrew Jackson painted himself as a man of the people, and one who opposed the centralized power of federal government. Like most presidents and parties who make that claim, who benefit from the deep stream of American political thought that wants government small, cheap, responsive, and close to home, he didn't really mean it. Federal expenditures soared during his term in office. Settling the West wasn't cheap, and the federal government played a role with Indian removal and internal improvements. But Jackson's term in office did represent his party's resistance to federal power in a different way. They hated the banking system and its centralized power. There's an important incident in Jackson's presidency called the BankWars that explains what I mean. But it's going to take a while to explain. Let me start with how banks work. A bank takes a deposit from you, the balance in your account, and it lends it out to others. It loans money at interest. It invests in profit-seeking business, and therefore makes money when that loan is repaid at interest. But that's not all. Banks actually lend out more money than they take in. How? This is a 19th century example. Today, banks are regulated by the Federal Reserve, which holds their reserves. But in the 19th century, each bank printed its own money. The Federal Bank of the United States was the exception. Most banks were chartered and regulated by the individual states. State and local banks took in money in the form of deposits and held a certain amount of money in reserve as specie, or gold and silver, and then printed money on the strength of those reserves to circulate and lend out. Imagine you got paid in one of these notes. You had to get it turned into goods. How did that happen? You'd try to spend it at the shop, but the shopkeeper wouldn't know about this bank in Austin and whether it existed and how to get the money out of it in exchange for this note. He'd accept it since all the money was like this. He'd accept it, but he wouldn't give you the full amount. He'd take some off the top for his own risk. So he would discount the note say, give you $18 worth of goods for a $20 bill from some faraway bank, or whatever he calculated it was worth. And banking in the 19th century was really the Wild West. Somebody could set up a bank, take a bunch of deposits, issue banknotes they'd use to pay bills and customers, then disappear before any of those banks arrived out of circulation, expecting to be redeemed out of the deposits. This was really common, and these wildcat banks, as they were known, diminished people's trust in the whole system. But people used their state banks, and all these forms of currency were flowing through the economy. You can imagine that counterfeiting was a roaring business. A whole region near the Canadian border produced false banknotes for state and local banks, and people used them, and they entered circulation too. Firms printed magazines to show which notes were real and which were fake, but these just made it easier to make false documents. And all these currencies were flowing around the economy, and some were used to pay federal government, to pay taxes, to buy land, to pay tariffs on goods as they were imported, and so the currency tended to flow into federal accounts, and the bank that held these banknotes as federal money could present them for payment at the state and local banks at any time. So, the bank that held the federal deposits controlled, essentially, the flow of credit and the liquidity of the economic system. It could restrain or expand the economy by its actions with these banknotes. And the federal government held its money in the Bank of the United States, the most stable bank in the country. The first Bank of the United States had been chartered in 1791, and it was the brainchild of the Federalist Constitution framer, Alexander Hamilton. The bank was then rechartered as a corporation in 1816 as the Second Bank of the United States. It held the deposits of the federal government, and the government owned 20% of it. The rest was in private hands. Notably, that of Nicholas Biddle, Philadelphia financier. Its charter was due to expire in 1836. Congress passed legislation to renew its charter in 1832, and Jackson vetoed it. Vetoed the charter of the Bank of the United States. Jackson and the Democrats believed that the Federal Bank of the United States was a federal power not enumerated in the Constitution, and that keeping all the U.S. money in the private bank tended to centralize power over the economy as a whole. The kind of thing the Whigs liked, with their pro-growth, big government ideas, not the Democrats, who spoke for the little guy. And so Jackson removed the money from the central bank and placed the deposits in state banks, which became known as pet banks, his pets, receiving the favor of federal monies. And so the bank wars of the 1830s represent one of the ways that Andrew Jackson's actions as president supported his party's ideology that resisted central power from the federal government, and the soaring federal expenditures of his presidency count against it. But he's a tricky guy to understand, and it's a tricky period. For one thing, his party relied heavily on tariffs to fund the federal government. Let's talk a little bit about tariffs and how they work, and what they do economically, since they play such an important role in the emerging division between North and South. Because this lecture ends with another big episode on the path to civil war, the conflict over tariffs and the nullification crisis. A tariff is quite simply a tax on imported goods. It makes imported goods cost more, which gives a price advantage to domestic industry. And the taxes make money for the government to fund its operations. Congress passed its first tariff in 1789 and called it the Second Declaration of Independence because they intended it to set the young United States on the path to economic independence. During the War of 1812, tariffs protected U.S. business from British incursions into American economic growth. After the War of 1812, and after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, 1805 to 1815, post-French Revolution, the Europeans were dumping all their leftover goods on U.S. markets. So tariffs were established as a permanent feature of the federal government in 1816, and increased in 1824, and again in 1828. Here you can see the tariff as a percentage of the goods value. In each case, Local lawmakers sought to increase the tariff on imports of products of their local industry. They were attempting to protect their constituency's business, raising rates higher and higher, especially on iron and cloth textiles, which the British made cheaper than Americans, but the Americans wanted to make more of their own. By 1828, some goods were taxed above 60% of their value, adding more than half again to the price of goods for sale. This high tariff of 1828 was actually established by John Quincy Adams, but President Andrew Jackson let it remain, and this caused regional conflict. The 1828 tariff was so hated that it became known as the Tariff of Abominations, because tariffs protected domestic industry, and people who made their money from exports didn't benefit, and the South made exports, grew cotton for sale to the British. You slap a tariff on British imports, it's likely they'll stop buying your exports or put their own taxes on your exports to make them less competitive. The South was worried about all their cotton, which went to the British and to the North. What if the British stopped buying? Trade war! Among the most vociferous opponents of the tariff was the state of South Carolina, which began in 1828 to promote the idea that they didn't have to go along with this federal tariff. In fact, they believed they could nullify any federal law they didn't wish to obey as a state. Leading the charge for nullification was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Here's the thing. He was Andrew Jackson's own vice president, and he resigned his office in order to pursue nullification. Andrew Jackson gave in and passed a lower tariff in 1832, but South Carolina could not be appeased. Remember what they say about South Carolina: too small to be its own country, too big to be a mental institution. Remember, too, its old history as a rice-producing colony, and an early adopter of the plantation system using slave labor, settled by the British from Barbados, a sugar island. In November 1832, with Jackson re-elected president, South Carolina nullified the tariff and said, come February 1st, you can't enforce that law here. In response, Congress passed and Jackson signed a force bill in 1833, which allowed American officials, federal officials, to use force to collect duties and imposts. And South Carolina caved in, but it simmered with resentment for another 30 years. The tariff played next to no role in the next crisis of the Union, 25 years later, but the memory lingered, especially in the South, that had voted against the force bill but seen it passed, and especially in South Carolina, which had proposed nullifying a federal tax disliked by the whole region, but it was left hanging on its own against the strong central government led by Democratic champion President Andrew Jackson. So, it's a complex, contradictory period. Economic growth, expansion of the vote, rise of the Democratic Party, and, in opposition, the Whigs, the second party system. A politics marked by sharp conflicts over economic policy, federal expenditures, bank wars, and where the government should keep its money. Tariff wars that led one state to decide that it didn't have to obey federal laws, that it could nullify them. A precursor to the secession crisis, which started the Civil War. The regions were growing apart.